Hi everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Just Students Talking. I have with me Katie.
Hi, I'm
Hello,
Katie.
Katie. Hi. Thanks for coming in today. And we have chosen to take a look at the Diaries of Drezile Lawson. And we have in front of us a single box that carries a recollection of her diaries and other recorded possessions. It spans from about 1893 to 1941, almost 50 years. It's extremely well organized, and inside are a total of three diaries that she wrote in, and they always have newspaper clippings or other paperwork attached to the back of it. And it's also combined with daily diary entries on weather, local events, newspaper clippings. But on a general note, Drezile Lawson was quite consistent in recording her daily life. She was a toll gate keeper. She lived in Athens, Ontario. She's extremely organized and extremely consistent in recording the weather, particularly. So, not much from what you hear, but what can we make out of her? And why have we called out to women today? Stick around to hear more on a peculiar someone dismantling the diaries of Drezile Lawson.
Salt applied with a soft cloth removes egg stains, and ammonia roughed on with a soft cloth is a fine polisher. For a clock that doesn't run, saturate a piece of absorbent cotton with kerosene oil and place it onside the clock below the pendulum. If mice come in through holes in the floor, we fill the holes with common laundry soap, and the mice will never gnaw through their little traps in the cellar. A few drops of alcohol will remove greasy smoke from damp chimneys when soap and water will not. The odor of fish can be removed by boiling water with a little vinegar.
And we're back to crack the code. Who is this Drezile Lawson? What kind of a woman was she? And how did she live as a woman in the 1800s? By the way, this is all hypothetical, and none of what we claim is factually proven. We're going to crack that code from looking at the style of her writing, the materiality, and her marital status, which we will delve into briefly. Honey, do you want to start us off? What did you think about Drezile in general?
She's definitely a peculiar woman. To begin, in her toll books, which were also used as a diary, the amount of calculation she does in her toll books and on pieces of paper, even on the back of letters, letter envelopes, seemed as though she was obsessed with order and precision. I'm going to delve into a little bit more detail on that later when we start to discuss the specifics of her diaries. But in all three of her toll books, the month, year, and dates are all listed in the same format. So she definitely is a consistent person who is persistent with her own responsibilities. Personality wise, I'd imagine her to be, a little bossy, and that comes from how organized and how dense her writing in her diaries are and the way she records things. In Toll Book 1, it's completely filled, and it's actually quite satisfying for you to look at, but it's not so easy to look at. And I know Katie, you wanted to delve into her household hints and her duck hunting, but in terms of the contents of her writing, even those aspects as to why she wrote those in her toll books were very distant to me. And as a career woman herself, she encompasses kind of a masculine hobby, a job that she seemed actually quite capable of, like duck hunting and as a toll gatekeeper. But on top of that, she's an expert on house stuff, so that, definitely threw me off. As a career woman and a woman in the home, Drezile seems sophisticated and in control, definitely. The toll book seems to act all as her memo book, her workbook, and her diary. But I'm still, wondering what kind of life this draws on. I'm definitely curious as to what you think as well.
Yeah, Drizzle is definitely different from what the common Victorian women were like, and I think she's important to discuss because I think she's a good example of someone who's progressive for this time period. I did some research about the roles of women during the 19th century, as this diary and toll book was written between the years 1892 to 1941. According to Kathy Pius, during the 19th century, men were associated with the public sphere as it was considered to be the more masculine realm, whereas women were more associated with the private and domestic space that was considered gendered as feminine. As I did more research, I came across a historical research article titled Women's Role in Society in the 1800s, which stated that women were expected to remain in this domestic sphere and were expected to be submissive. So they were expected to bear children, take care of the housework, submit to their husbands, who were the breadwinners of the family. Their entire financial status and situation depended on their husbands. However, after the women's rights movement it started gaining more rights for women. In Canada during the year 1872, Ontario passed legislation which permitted women to earn wages free of their husband's control, according to the Public Service Alliance of Canada, which was a huge accomplishment for women, but only 19.9% of women were actually in the workforce during the year 1941. And these jobs usually consisted of domestic roles like seamstresses or servants. So the fact that Drezile had this toll book in 1892 is amazing because this would have been very unusual for women during this time, especially because toll gatekeeping was considered to be a male profession. Keep in mind, women weren't even allowed to vote in Ontario until 1917, according to the Canadian Encyclopedia. So the fact that Drezile had her own profession was very progressive. Author Kathy Pierce writes about public and private roles for women during the Victorian era, and here Drezile would have been crossing gender boundaries as she appeared in both the private and public sphere. Sure, Drezile was still part of the domestic life, as she kept a book of household hints, which gave tips to other domestic housewives. Some of the tips were for things like how to keep the salt dry in the salt shaker in order for it not to clump together. Or she would tell people to use a slice of potato to clean oil paintings. We heard a bit of her excerpt earlier in this recording. These things would have been expected upon the domestic housewife, as they usually took care of the house, and this tells us that she did take on the role of the housewife. And according to her record, she was married to Gordon Lawson. Most
Right.
likely, Drezile would have recorded certain events in the privacy of her own household as well, adding more presence to her domestic life. Also, according to Kathy Pierce, women were, quote, to remain unpolluted by commerce, meaning that spaces like theaters, cafes, or department stores were not welcoming per se for women, but we know that Drezile was a part of that public commercial space as she kept grocery receipts. This could also impact the reason why Drezile liked to record and keep track of her financials within her diary. Since, according to the essay on women's role in society that I read, women had limited control of their lives. Perhaps by recording her own thoughts and calculations, this is a way for Drezile so she could have control over her life. Another thing that would be considered to be a part of her public life, which she recorded in her diary, was her religion. Drezile was clearly a Christian as she recorded Bible verses, and, assuming she went to church, this was seen as the quote, a public arena, according to Pius. Drezile recorded a lot of things, but one of the most prominent things that I noticed was about her deaths in the book. She has an entire page dedicated to the deaths of her friends, and part of the reason why she might have been so dedicated to her religion was because it gave her a sense of comfort about life after death. Religion, in my opinion, could also link with that pure appearance of femininity that was sought after in the Victorian era as well. Anyways, I've ranted enough, but to sum everything up, Drezile was an amazing woman as she crossed gender boundaries in a way, merging between the private domestic sphere and the public sphere that was originally excluded just for men.
Mhm.
Her toll book is an example of her public life in the workforce, along with her grocery receipts and religion, and her household hints represent her life as the Victorian housewife. She also mentions how she went duck hunting in 1908, which I assume would not be typically something a woman would do, as it's more violent. This just further shows how Drezile wasn't scared to rebel against society's expectations, which kind of reminds me of Anne Lister and her diary that we talked about earlier. What are your thoughts?
Wow, that's you gave so much information, so much good research on the role of women during exactly the period that she would record her diaries in. And I'm actually really intrigued about the progressive aspect because I think I very much agree with that. I also did a little research myself on toll gatekeepers during the 1800s to the 1900s, and I actually found an article from a site called the Little Red Umbrella. It describes like what a toll gate looked like in the 1800s, and it actually looks like a cottage. And it actually kind of seems to go hand in hand with that domestic space she also encompasses in that you've mentioned in your research, how women were expected to be put into those domestic spaces. But this is kind of different because as a toll gatekeeper, she is in a very public space. It was her workspace. The article is actually based on Toronto toll gatekeepers, but surprisingly, they actually mentioned that there was a prevalent amount of female population in that job market, but there was a general amount where you could actually get a handful of female toll gate keepers. And back then, roads were very, very bad, in very, very bad condition, and it apparently pissed people off. On a general note, this wasn't just in Toronto. It was kind of a toll gate culture that people hated having to pay for crossing these gates on very, very dirty and muddy roads. And it was a common practice to avoid paying the tolls altogether. So people really tried to get away with not paying for that. And this explains the anxiety we see on the page of her recording to the point that fills up the entire page. You've seen that too, right? Like she seems to fill every single tiny spot that's left in the page until there's like no room to even write. This issue
Yeah.
was actually so prevalent that Cornelius Krekov, he's one of the most famous and iconic early Canadian artists, and he has a whole series of paintings about people whipping their horses up to full speed so that they could just blow past the toll houses and to avoid paying it. And in Wales, people actually rioted. And interestingly, they dressed up as women to destroy the toll gates under the cover of darkness. And that's directly quoted from the article that I read. The article also mentions how they call themselves, I might pronounce this wrong, but Rebeccates. And it was after Genesis 24:60, another reference to her religion. And they blessed Rebecca and said unto her, let thy possess the gate of those which hate them. So, I mean, I propose that Drezile was aware of this, and she's heightened her image as extremely. My image of her was extremely heightened for her to look courageous and being able to record and possibly confront this kind of violence in this kind of culture during that time. Toll gates, they now operate electronically, especially after the 407. Things have gotten a lot more convenient in Canada. But back then, that was the hardships that she, supposedly might have gone through. And so I think that lies extremely well with how much of a strong and progressive woman that she is to be, and that you mentioned in your research. But I do think a lot of her life is very much private. And I actually see this in terms of the use of her space on her diaries. I can give a couple examples from observing the materiality of her diaries. If you look at Toll Book 1, Drazile's use of space on the page is extremely organized, but it's also complicated. Her writing isn't the easiest to interpret, but she almost seems obsessed with filling up that space on each page. For example, in the year 1901 of September, now this page is interesting. I'm reading a list of people who made payments from top to around the middle of the page. So I'm guessing that was a part of her job. And this part is bordered, so she draws a little box around it, and then she seems to have turned the toll book upside down. But now I see notes written upside down that lists a bunch of other names who have made payments. And again, I see that the toll book has there's writing done horizontally. And in this part, I'm reading paid honey, 15 baskets, and very randomly, Nepola's home paid $1 on or either in 1900. And to me, it looks like a general list of groceries and a random note of a large purchase. But I probably sound completely lost right now. And it's true. I've actually been lost throughout reading this entire collection. And I'm actually pretty sure you've been through that same experience. I have this
Yeah, for
random
sure.
example. Yeah. I have this random example of a calendar sheet on August 1913, and on the back of it, there's a random writing at the top corner that says, thank Sheldon, and then random calculations with dates beside them and around them. She seems to have an interesting flexibility and relationship with her toll book, or her diary, because she imposes herself and her own style onto the page, and at the same time, tends to conform to the boundaries within the long narrow sizing of the toll book. So there's this reciprocating relationship between her and the toll book, and I thought that was just so interesting, with the way she maximizes the amount of space that she takes up. And sometimes she crams her writing at the top of the page. She writes down the month on the top of the page and then the numbers each day of the month on each line. So we can tell she writes these numbers beforehand because some of the days are blank, and especially this is prevalent in her second toll book. So this further emphasizes the fact that she's always prepared. The way she writes down, it seems to show how prepared she is, and she's just so conscious of her surroundings. What do you think? That was a big rant.
Interesting that people felt so strongly about paying tolls. Obviously, no one wants to pay for something, but to fully run past the toll gate is another story. I guess they
Yeah,
wouldn't have license plates on a horse, so they could probably get away with it. We definitely would not be
right.
able to get away with that now.
Yeah.
As for feeling lost in her diary, I'm definitely with you on that one because I had a hard time going through her diary as everything is so crammed on the page, as you've mentioned. It's almost like she used this book for general notes that came up in her day to day life and just random thoughts that she had. I guess she wasn't aware that she would be writing for a public audience in the future, unlike Dorothy Wordsworth, who was aware that she was writing for an audience. Also, by
Mhm.
recording the name of her loved ones, Drezile brings their names into the public sphere today, unknowingly, I would think, as a sort of mourning and remembering of their loss.
Yeah.
I personally liked looking into Drazile's diaries because what attracted it to me personally was the fact that she was such an unusual person for her time period. But with that being said, I also didn't find her super relatable because she didn't write down her feelings. She merely just
Mm-hmm.
seemed to state the events that happened, and she wrote down
Yeah.
calculations on household hints, which I can't necessarily relate to now. What do you
Yeah.
think?
No, I think I agree to a certain extent. But I think this diary was actually kind of relatable. I don't know, maybe she seems to have a similar character as I do. I always need to be in control of what I'm doing right now, and I'm so obsessed with my responsibilities. And I mean, she seemed like someone with a lot of responsibilities too. She's a toll gatekeeper. She has all these household hints. She does duck hunting, um, and I mean, in terms of writing and recording her feelings, it's fair that not putting them down makes it less relatable for the readers and a lot more difficult for the readers. But I felt that maybe it could feel like another responsibility to have to record that feeling. So I felt that rather than recording the personal feelings, she would rather feel it at the moment. And recording it might have lost its whole point of actually feeling it. In Lindsay Bloom's article that we read in class, I write for myself and strangers. She speaks specifically to private diaries as public documents, and she said that truly private diaries are those bare bones uh, works written primarily to keep a record of receipts and expenditures, the weather, and they're so tense that they seem coded, and no reader outside the author's immediate society or household could understand them without extra textual information. So, I mean, she's very difficult to crack. I don't know if we've cracked her yet. Maybe not. Maybe a little bit. Um, but that in itself makes it so private and so emotionally deep that even the audience isn't able to figure that out. But that's what I think.
Very interesting. Well, I think we could go on and on about Drazile's diary, but unfortunately, we're out of time. To sum everything up, Drazile was a progressive woman for her time, crossing societal boundaries, and we definitely don't think she was a submissive woman per se. Women today still have ways to go in terms of equality in society, but I hope we can look at Drazile as an inspiration to be your own person and not feel the need to follow the crowd. Now it's time to turn it back to the audience, as Honey and I have disagreed on a few things, like her public and private spheres. Write your thoughts in the comments section, and we'll discuss it next time on Just Students Talking. See you later.
Right. Thanks, Katie. Bye, everyone.